Hello, this is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to another episode of Tabletops and Taverns. This week we are going to cover the Old-School Renaissance, a topic near and dear to my heart. What is the OSR, also known as the Old-School Revival, among other things? Well, it's a movement in the RPG community, or at least some portions of it, some small portions of it, to revitalize the old gaming systems, especially the earlier versions of Dungeons and Dragons. Doesn't necessarily mean it's all about the early versions of Dungeons and Dragons. There are a lot of subsections, including retro clones, which are probably the most popular, but also new gaming systems that kind of duplicate that old school feel. So, what is, an old school gaming? Well, over the years, you have to understand the first role-playing games were produced in the early 70s, and they were derived from war games. Now, in the ensuing years, systems have become more complicated, they've become more thorough, they've documented the rules for pretty much everything you can do as a character. They've also taken influence from other media. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but it has resulted in an evolution of the game that makes the earlier editions have a distinctly different feel than the newer editions. The most clear demonstration of this is the transition between Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition and 5th edition. They had gone, I believe, and many others believe, too far into turning the role-playing game into something more akin to a computer game done with pen and paper than an actual role-playing game. And so, as a result, the 5th edition tried to regain some of that older edition feel. Now, when you're talking about the OSR, the old school Renaissance, whatever it is, then you're talking about games that are older yet. You're talking about things that duplicate the first few editions of D&D and similar games like it. Now, in terms of the feel, the look and the feel of the game, you can go ahead and boil the differences down to a few basic principles. First is simplicity of rules. The older rule sets didn't have the whole wealth of skill systems and development time put into them that the newer editions have. Therefore, the rules tended to be not necessarily less obtuse, because in fact many of the rules were kind of vague or confusing. However, they had less of them. And what this did was it encouraged both players and dungeon masters to rely on moment-by-moment rulings or moment-by-moment decision-making on the part of the DM or whoever was running the game than on, is this the right way to do it, looking through a book for whatever obscure rule covered the situation. Now, for the most part, what that meant was that older school players in older school games, tended to have, I don't want to say more freedom, because your freedom in a game is only limited by your dungeon master's imagination. But they were, I don't want to say trained, but they were acclimated to having more options. The people that learned, people who are older like me or who learned on older editions, they play the game a little bit differently than people who only learn after, say, 3rd edition or so. After 3rd edition, the game started to become... I'm focusing purely on D&D when I'm just give you an edition number. But after 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons, the game started to become more simulationist, and it became heavily inspired and closer to computer role-playing games. That's all well and good. There's a lot to be said for having a game where you can simulate almost everything that you want your character to do. However, it set a sort of mindset amongst the players that really sacrifice a lot of what the tabletop game, that is a first person-to-person game, has to offer. Now, a computer can crunch numbers all day long. It can go ahead and run whatever simulation you want all day long. But when you play a computer role-playing game, you are limited by the actions which are programmed into the game. Now, on a pen and paper game, you aren't. However, the more actions are defined by a system, the more modern gamers get into their heads that they can only do those actions. And yes, I know a good role player will go ahead and just go squirrely, just try anything, and that's actually a very good thing. But I'm not sure how to put this politely, but I've noticed that even people who are used to old school games, when they've been playing a modern system for a while, they tend to get lazier with their character actions in terms of descriptions, in terms of their creativity. I'm not saying that they don't come up with creative ideas. What I'm saying is that it happens less and less often. When you're engaged in a combat where everything is simulated perfectly, you start throwing ideas that you've used in earlier editions of the game to great advantage, and just taking those ideas and throwing them out the window. Just because you're more concerned about whether your character can use a particular, sword swing once per day or whatever, especially in 4th edition. If you can use a particular attack motive once per encounter, you're more focused on that attack motive than what other things are going on in the combat and what creative things you can do. And when you try and go above and beyond that, if it's a poor DM that's only got this mindset that you can only do what's on your character sheet, then they may say no. And that's really sad, because a great person that I watch repeatedly basically has once said, and I agree with this wholeheartedly, if your players want to do something, the best thing you can do is to say yes. Don't give them an automatic success, but when they come up with an idea, let them try it. And this whole turning the game into a computer simulation kind of thing or a computer game kind of focus, that throws a lot of that out the window. An older school game tends to support more narrative focus. Yes, you're still rolling a die to determine whether you hit or not, but the idea that you can do a lot more than just swing your sword is there as part of the game. I want to go ahead and tell a little bit of story here. It's happened in a 3.5 edition D&D campaign I was running some years ago. So basically, I had a mix of players that were both old and new to the game. Some had been playing since 1st edition. Some of them had been playing since only since 3rd edition came out. And it was a really weird mixed bag, because I noticed that when they started playing, didn't necessarily give an indication as to how creative they would be. Rather, it was more along the lines of how long they had been playing 3rd edition specifically. Kind of hinted at whether they would look above and beyond their characters. And one person that I was dealing with, one of the characters, he was actually brand new to role-playing games. And we'd had a few adventures where they'd gone ahead and got into some trouble. And he was playing a barbarian, because let's face it, if you're new to role-playing games in general, some sort of fighter type is probably going to be your best bet, because you don't have to keep track of a lot of abilities, which just gets back into what I was saying before. So they were fighting in this tower. It wasn't a huge tower. It was maybe about 3 or 4 stories. And they were up on the 4th story. And while they were investigating the room, a fire mephit, which for those of you who are not familiar, a mephit is basically an elemental imp. But this fire mephit flew by the window and tagged him with a firebolt as soon as it passed, and then flew away. And it went on like this for 3 or 4 rounds. Only a couple people had readied bows, and they were only able to hit it maybe once or twice as it flew around. Most of the times they missed. And so the barbarian was finally getting sick of this shit. So he said, what I'm going to do is, next time that mephit comes around, it's flying how far out? About 5 feet, 10 feet? I said, yeah, it's about a square and a half away, so it's about 10 foot. He said, next time it flies around, I'm going to try and jump out the window and just grab it. Yeah, he's going to do a flying tackle out of the 4th-story window of this tower. Seems like something a barbarian would do, but he asked me, can I do that? And I was about to say, yes, of course you can do that. Or you can try. And some of the other players chimed up and said, no, that's not in the rules. No, it's not in the rules. Why would you want to stifle somebody else's creativity in such a way? You know, just because there's no flying tackle, rule set, flying tackle attack specifically in the rules, doesn't mean that it can't be done. So I said, hold on a sec. Now, a good DM in any edition will figure out how to allow his players to do it. In an older edition, I would have simply said, yeah, go ahead and make a strength check to get over there. See if you can propel yourself farther, and then make an attack roll to hit, see if you can grab it. But everything is kind of spelled out. Once you get to 3rd edition and later, almost everything is kind of spelled out. So I said, well, you got to get there, so let's see your jump check. Of course, he's a barbarian with a huge amount of strength. His jump check is based on strength. He gets there. He jumps there. Clears the distance, no problem. All right. Now make a grapple check. And, of course, the Mephit's clawing and biting because they have natural attacks, and the natural attacks threaten the area, and when you try to grapple someone, you got to take those attacks up front. Mephit didn't hit him. He managed to grapple the Mephit. So I said, okay, you're now grappling a Mephit in midair. That Mephit can't carry you because it doesn't have that sort of strength, so you immediately fall. So I says, okay, I'll take it. Falling damage rolled, he survives easily. And he manages to hold on to that Mephit because he's a big strong ass of a barbarian that is basically just nothing but raw strength. And he holds this Mephit down until the rest of the people go all the way around the tower and, manage to finish off the Mephit. Now, that made for an actually very interesting scene. You get this barbarian doing this flying tackle out the window. He saves the day. His player is happy even though he's battered and bruised. The other people are happy because they aren't taking a firebolt to the back of the skull every 5 minutes. And if I'd followed the other player's advice and said, no, you're not allowed to do it, then we would have just simply run into a whole roll the dice, attack and roll the dice, attack and roll the dice, kind of routine that would have probably eventually taken the Mephit down, but it would have taken a lot longer and been a lot more boring. So I guess the moral of the story is that when you're talking about an old school system, they rely on rulings rather than rules. And I'm ripping that off directly from Matt Finch's excellent old school primer. I suggest anybody who's into old school gaming get that. It's free. I'll give a link. I'll go more into detail at the end of the video. Put a link in the description below. But anyway, rulings rather than rules. That means if you think your players can do it, let them do it. Even if there's no rule defined, let them do it. Figure something out. And this applies to all editions. But because there's so many rules that came up in later editions, people more inclined, if a rule exists, people are more inclined to look for the rule rather than just allow it. In other words, if you give somebody a hammer, all of a sudden everything looks like a nail. If you give someone a big compendium of rules that cover almost every situation, but not quite every situation, those not quites start, making the DM think, oh, try something else, because it's going to be in the rules. It's going to be easier for me to judge. And that's the kind of thinking that I really, really kind of gets to me. Another thing about old school games, especially, and kind of gives some heart and soul to the old school Renaissance, is the power level. Now, what do I mean by power level? In the older edition games, they were really based on kind of a sword and sorcery sort of feel. Like Conan, like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, like Solomon Kane. They had high grand adventures, but the individuals weren't just immediately superhuman. Whereas in a modern D&D game, or a modern Pathfinder game, or whatever, once you start getting above like 5th or 6th level, the characters really do become truly superhuman. And they start disregarding the low common NPCs because they can clearly do nothing against them. I had a Pathfinder group where they, in fact, just about half a year ago now, they were only level 7. And they encountered a army of zombies, just literally over 100-something zombies. And instead of doing hit and run tactics, instead of getting the information and getting back to their superiors, they're like, bring them on, we can take them all. And the thing about it is they could, and they did. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but when you're looking at the power scale difference, I mean, level 7 or so is not even, but almost like it's a little over a third of the way through the level progression in Pathfinder. That is not a really high-level character by Pathfinder standards, and they're already doing things that are basically taking entire armies to make the equivalent of. When you're looking at older school games, even to a high-level fighter, 7th or 8th level in an old school game is considered a high-level character. Your average orc or your average zombie still poses something of a threat to them. This is not a constant. It's just because everything kind of flattens out. The statistics have less meaning. I mean, yeah, they're nice to have, but everything kind of gets squashed together in power levels, so that at the very high end, you can do a lot that the low end can't, but you're not Superman. You're not totally invulnerable to the things beneath you. You're going to take some hits. You're going to take your licks, and you're probably going to get overwhelmed if you decide to go up against 100 zombies without some sort of plan and backup. Let's take a look at the statistics. We'll look at Swords and Wizardry, because it's a fairly good clone of what was originally the Dungeons & Dragons white box. And I will go into some of the retro clones and similar old school games at the end. But Swords and Wizardry is a good retro clone of the original D&D white box. That was released in 1974, I believe, sometime around there. The highest level you can roll is an 18. I mean, the highest ability score you can roll is an 18 out of 3d6. And the highest ability score you can roll in D&D 5th edition or whatever, or D&D 4th edition and 3rd edition, around there, they all use similar things, is an 18. Now, in those later editions, you can take a race and bump that up to 20 or so. So the absolute max is 20. But they're still using that whole 3 to 18 scale. But the difference is, in the older edition, they used a bell curve. So everything in the middle was no adjustment. It had no adjustments associated with it. So that you didn't agonize if you got a 12 versus a 10. You didn't agonize if you rolled an 8 versus a 10, because that was still average. It was a little bit on the low end of average. It would contribute to role-playing, but you didn't necessarily feel that your character was crippled just because you had a -1 in a stat. In fact, even if you rolled the absolute minimum, and even if you rolled the absolute maximum, the bonus or the penalty was only +1 or +2. Now that's a huge thing on a D20. That's a 5 to 10% difference on a D20. But it was only a 5 to 10% difference. When you look at the modern statistics layout, because it's a linear layout, what you end up with is even an 18 gives you a +4. Now on a D20 roll, that +4 all of a sudden makes a shitload of difference. It's like a 20% difference. That's damn near a quarter of the roll. If you take a 20 if you get a 20 in a statistic, that bumps that bonus up to +5, and that's entirely possible in 5th edition and Pathfinder and so on. That is nearly a quarter of the roll, even at level 1, just purely dependent on your statistic. And because most modern systems allow you to do a point-buy system, then yeah, almost every fighter is going to have like an 18 or a 20 strength. Almost every wizard is going to have like an 18 or a 20 intelligence. And so, even though, and this goes back to the rules versus ruling and things, even though there are less rules, there's less feats, there's less skills that you can write down on your sheet of paper on the older editions, and it gives you the impression that all characters on paper look very similar. When it comes down to the actual play, it actually encourages them to be different. And when you've got rules, when you've got bonuses for every little thing, then what you end up with is a number of characters. Even if you've got a ton of classes and a ton of special kits or whatever, most characters in the same role will look awful similar. They'll have similar equipment layouts. And that's one of the things that a lot of the new gaming systems, a lot of people that theory craft that a lot or kind of bitch about, is that we're always going to have a +5 weapon. We're always going to have certain minimum magic items in order to make a character viable. I mean, not even good, just viable, because everything's geared towards that power progression level. What you end up with is, even though you're given all this choice, it's just the illusion of choice. Whereas if you're talking about like a 0 edition game, or the white box game, or a basic D&D game, your statistics are rolled randomly, and you're not spending a lot of time deciding, how do I best optimize my feats to squeeze out the damage that I absolutely have to have in order to face the challenges before me. And therefore, you end up with characters that use a wide variety of different weapons. They use a wide variety, not necessarily a wide variety of different armors, but the different armor types are more viable than, say, everybody in the high end of the modern games. And so the characters have more diversity, really, in the best possible way. And between that character diversification and the fact that they aren't superhuman, they're more human. They're more on a they're extraordinary, but they're more on a believable level. The characters themselves end up being more relatable, and as a result, I believe, at least in my experience, the individual players tend to play them a little bit better, just because you don't have to guess. A lot of people. Well, let's put an example. One of my players in my Pathfinder game has an 8 in intelligence, and he plays his character like an absolute freaking moron. But an 8 intelligence, even though it's below average, is not dribbling idiot levels. I mean, this is not a character that you need to put. You need to watch and keep on a leash. No, it's just slightly slow. The character may take a little bit longer to think of things than most. He's not like a rubber room material. He's not like, oh my god, this. But because he's so used to everything having to be positive, that 8 in intelligence meant that, all of a sudden I got to play this character like a moron. No, he doesn't. Now, if he'd had like a 4 intelligence or something, yeah. Or like even a 6 intelligence, yeah, that would be more in line. But the entire new school thing is that everything has this power creep. It encourages everybody to look at humans as really subhuman. Your average individual on the road, because they're so far above them, they get this mindset that the NPC, which is a perfectly reasonable human being, is actually subhuman compared to them, and that. It's an attitude that gets into the game and the play style. And I've really, really, really gone off course on this. Let's get back to old school. Okay, let's old school Renaissance. Some of the qualities are that it's more difficult. That gets thrown around. Oh, the old school is more difficult. It's got all kinds of issues. The DM's just going to go ahead and crush you with it. Not really. That's a misconception. The real issue with old school gaming is that when you're talking about a setting a game world that you're in, it's not designed around the player character. In old school gaming, the player character is considered just one person in a larger world. Therefore, the monsters don't magically adjust themselves to your power level. In newer games, even though they say, "Oh, go ahead and make the world really, really diverse with a lot of creatures," in practice, what happens is that when you go into an adventure, you'll know, especially if it's a pre-made adventure, especially if it's an off-the-shelf adventure, you'll generally know that your characters can take on anything they're put up against. They may have a challenge. It may give them a challenge. It may bring them to the brink of death. But generally speaking, they can go ahead and assume anything they encounter is going to be manageable. And that's not how the real world works. And, in a living, breathing setting that mimics the real world, if you walk into some dangerous woods, you may encounter wild animals even. I mean, even if you're talking about a totally realistic game, you might encounter wild animals that you cannot deal with. You may walk into the jungle and get jumped by a tiger, even if it's your first trip into the jungle. You've never been into the jungle before. Rare, but it might happen. Whereas in a modern game, your players are going to realize, oh, the DM isn't really going to throw anything at us that we can't handle if we're smart. And it takes a lot of the danger out. It takes a lot of the tension out. I mean, the worst they can hope, the worst that can happen is that they use stupid tactics or they roll poorly. Whereas in an older school game, because there's that element of danger, because there's that element of the unknown, the players are going to do things all of a sudden. Once they get used to the setting, they're going to do things that are just unheard of in modern gaming. How many times have you read through a modern adventure? If you're a DM and you're an experienced DM, how many times have you read through a modern adventure and it gives you all of this background that the characters can look up in town and you never use it because they never actually look it up? How many times? My group almost never looks ahead to the adventure. They never do research into what they may face. They never ask NPCs, or they rarely ask NPCs, "Oh, what's in that Forest of Mirkdoom?" But in an older school game, yeah, they're going to ask around because they want to know, hey, if I go into the Forest of Mirkdoom, is there anything really, really dangerous that I need to know about? They'll ask, a tavern, they'll ask around at the tavern. They may actually go to a sage or something and find out, hey, we've got to go ahead and find this ruin. We need to make sure we're not going to get our asses handed to us as soon as we step into the trees. Whereas in a modern game, the most preparation they'll do is, oh, we're going into the woods. Maybe we should bring a ranger or a druid. In an older school game, they'll say, oh, okay, we're going into the woods. We're going to need supplies. Because unless you want that cleric to sit there and memorize a bunch of create food and waters rather than heals, which we're going to critically need because he gets less spells, then we're going to want some basic supplies. We're going to want torches and lanterns because the wizard, he can cast light, but that would be at the expense of some other really useful spell like sleep. So yeah, he may have one light spell, but we want to have that kept in reserve just in case all the lights go out. For the most part, we're going to use mundane equipment to duplicate this. And hey, by the way, I heard, because I took the time to look around before we went into the woods, that there was a den of owlbears in there. Well, what the fuck are we going to do about owlbears? If say the character's only like level 2 or whatever. Well, a modern gamer will like, oh, owlbears, well, fuck, we'll just not go. An old school gamer may think, well, what can you do about owlbears at level 2? Well, we probably can't put any to sleep, or at least not to the effect that we can count on it. But hey, we can bring like some meat to try and distract them. or we can find out where their lair is, just ask around a little bit more so we can go around it, or we can hire pragmatically a bunch of torchbearers, because you don't have to outrun the owlbearer, you just have to outrun your henchmen. But they'll do a little bit more preparation in general. I'm not saying this applies to every gaming group. There are some modern gaming groups that are very good at looking ahead and that sort of thing. And those are the kinds that just basically steamroller over every adventure because they do take that time to look ahead. But when you're talking about most modern gaming groups that have just done nothing but modern gaming systems, they're going to be slightly more careless on average. And that carelessness can make for a poorer game quality, just because you want your characters to actually be worried about their lives. You want them to think that their characters can be not necessarily taken away at a moment's notice, but their characters are actually in a life and death struggle in a lot of times. And it's something that, I mean, that feeling is still there sometimes in modern gaming systems, but you have to really push it. A lot of times, unless it's the boss, it ain't a danger at all. And that's kind of one of the attitude differences between modern and old school, and one in which I find the old school style to be more rewarding. So, I mean, there are many other differences in old school versus modern gaming. But those, for the most part, are it. You know, old school focuses more on narrative. They focus more on evading combat than necessarily engaging in it. Because, you know, if it doesn't matter what kind of warrior you are, if you take an axe to the skull, you know, in real life, that's going to put a dent in your day, to say the least. So it basically, you know, goes on to the whole power level thing, where, you know, the modern gamers like, oh, we're superhuman. You know, the old school characters aren't quite there yet. They realize that they're still human. They have a touch of humility that's really good for them. Let's see, if you want to get into old school gaming, if I've piqued your interest at all with this rambling little diatribe here, there are some options. There's a lot of free options. Now, 3rd edition, say what you will about 3rd edition. What 3rd edition D&D brought to the table that was critical for the Oldschool Renaissance was the open gaming license. Because what that did was that put a lot of, not necessarily the systems themselves, but a lot of the terminology on the table for anybody to use, and a number of people took that terminology and basically recreated the older editions of Dungeons & Dragons with a few minor variations as new gaming systems. So let's go ahead and look at the, in my opinion, most popular ones. We'll talk about retro clones first. Now, retro clones are exactly what I was talking about. People who remade the old editions with the SRG, with the OpenGL license. Swords and Wizardry. I've mentioned this already before. It's Matt Finch put it together, I believe. Swords and Wizardry is used in a lot of Frog God Games stuff, and if you like old school and you love what I'm about to show you, or about to tell you about, then Frog God Games is a site that you want to look at. It has all kinds of modules and such, even for newer gaming systems, especially Pathfinder, that really harken back to that old first edition feel. Anyway, back to Swords and Wizardry. Swords and Wizardry is a retro clone of the first white box released in the first Dungeons & Dragons white box released in 1974, there and abouts, and the supplements. It's an excellent system. It's very streamlined, very usable, very readable. The book is nice. You can get it in printed copy, or you can get it online. Now, there are several editions of the white box. There are several editions of Swords and Wizardry. There's Swords and Wizardry white box, which is, I believe, free on some instances. You might want to look it up. But what that does, it contains just what was in that original Dungeons and Dragons box set. That is the first 3 books: Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and the other book that escapes me. That is the most basic you can get D&D at. There are just 3 classes: fighters, fighting men, clerics, and magic users. Thieves weren't even a thing. So that is just for the basic of basics. If you want to go real old school, that's the one you look at. Then there's Swords and Wizardry Core, which includes the supplements from later on, which includes things like Thieves, includes some other material. And then there's the Swords and Wizardry Complete Rulebook. Now, I believe that you can find the Swords and Wizardry Complete Rulebook. It used to be you could only buy it, but due to a Kickstarter reaching a milestone a couple years back, you can get the Swords and Wizardry Complete book on Drive-Thru RPG. And that has a lot of the optional classes that were introduced right before first edition came out, including things like the Assassin, the Paladin. It includes all the things from the supplements for the original Dungeons & Dragons, plus a lot of things from the Strategic Review, which was a newsletter that was released to support Dungeons & Dragons. And that's basically all what you would call the white box or 0th edition retro clone. And you know what? I really should have done my video talking about the editions of Dungeons & Dragons. I'll do that at some point. But anyway, after, if Swords and Wizardry is too primitive for your taste, there's the Labyrinth Lord system. Labyrinth Lord system duplicates the basic Dungeons & Dragons right before the 1980s red box. That is, it covers the Homes or the BX version of Dungeons & Dragons. You can get that online. It's got variations for both, original white box characters and for first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons style characters. They're called, respectively, the 0th edition and the Advanced Companion, or the Advanced Edition Companion. But it's a pretty reasonable clone of the early basic Dungeons & Dragons. So, if Swords and Wizardry is too primitive, Labyrinth Lord might be more up your alley. Now, if you want to start getting into where the game actually started getting the serious rules, I keep pointing back here, I think it's like for the first edition rules, then you'll be wanting to look for something called the OSRIC, the Old School Reference and Index Compendium, or compilation, whatever. That is produced by Knights and Knaves. It is also free. You can get it on lulu.com. Many of these games, because they are open license, you can get the books stripped down from art for free from their respective websites. I will put links in the description of all of these websites below, in the description below. Tripping over my words. Okay, so those are the basic retro clones. There's a bunch of other retro clones that are also really neat, and a lot of them are actually focused on one style of play or the other, like the Lamentations of the Flame Princess, which is an old school Dungeons & Dragons clone, retro clone, but it's more focused towards the weird fantasy, like you would see in like, Weird Tales type magazines and so on and so forth. Things that are almost like Lovecraftian in nature. And they've got a lot of variations of that sort of thing with the Old School Renaissance. But not all of them are retro clones. 2 things worth mentioning. One of them is actually considered one of the first kind of games produced in the Old School Renaissance. And that's a little thing called Castles and Crusades. Now, what's Castles and Crusades? Castles and Crusades is a D20 system, so it's based off the 3rd edition rule set, basically. But they've stripped a lot of the stuff down so it more resembles the first edition AD&D. So it's basically, in a nutshell, first edition AD&D using 3rd edition mechanics. And it's a very nice game. I have not actually played it. I've read a lot of it, but I can't get my group to play it for some reason. They just refuse to. But it is theoretically an excellent game. It's still in print. I don't believe that one has a free option, but you can get the reprints on Amazon. It's being revised up until this day. But it is basically it manages, because it takes the old school and the new school systems together. it really feels like a new game system, because it is a new game system, using old school stylings. Another really nice old school style game is the Dcc Rpg, or the Dungeon Crawl Classics RPG from Goodman Games. Goodman Games is another third-party publisher that did a real good job of putting out old school modules for new school systems. The Dungeon Crawl Classics line is excellent. I recommend it to anybody who's played 3rd edition and wants to get an old school feel without using the older edition. But they put together Dcc Rpg, which is its own standalone product, and it is a brand new role-playing game. It takes some elements from 3rd edition, but it really captures that feel of sword and sorcery style adventure that the old school editions had. And it's not for everybody. For instance, to make a character, you actually make 3 or 4, and then you run them through adventures, and whichever one survives, hey, that's the one that's the peon that you got up to level 1, and that's the one you stick with. They produce a number of adventures for that system, so it's worth looking into. I'll put links to Goodman Games in the description. But there are many, many old school games out there now, and that just it's not a huge popularity. I think the last statistics I looked at, it encompasses maybe 2 or 3% of the overall role-playing game, milieu. But considering how fragmented the market is, that's actually pretty good. So, hey, if you've got this far, listen to me rambling, congratulations, you are pretty old school. I hope you've enjoyed this little brief primer. I admit to shamelessly ripping off a number of concepts from Matt Finch's old school primer, although I hope that I added a little bit more for some people. Have you never heard of the old school revolution or the old school Renaissance? Check it out. I'll put the links to all the systems that I've mentioned in the description below. And as always, this has been the RPG Crawler. If you like what you've seen, remember to like, dislike if you dislike it, comment if you got commentary, subscribe for more RPG content. Until next time, take care and goodbye.